So today, the world is celebrating what it believes is a reopening. Oil drops, markets rise, and headlines say stability has returned. But I want you to pause for a moment and ask a different question. If power forced this outcome, why did it arrive as a choice? Because what you are watching is not the success of pressure. It is the quiet proof that pressure no longer works the way it used to. What you are seeing right now is being framed as a victory. And that framing is exactly where the misunderstanding begins. Because when people look at outcomes, they tend to focus on the visible action. The strait is open, ships can pass, markets stabilize, and they assume that the side which demanded that outcome must have achieved it. But that assumption only holds if the action was forced. And the moment you look closely at how this actually unfolded, that assumption begins to break down. Because nothing about this reopening carries the signature of compulsion. There is no sign of urgency, no indication of collapse, no evidence that Iran reached a breaking point and conceded under pressure. Instead, what you see is timing that feels deliberate, language that feels calculated, and conditions that were not dictated from the outside, but introduced from within. And that difference between something being forced and something being chosen is the entire story. Power, in its most visible form, is often mistaken for control. Warships, blockades, sanctions, statements of dominance. These are all expressions of power. But control is something quieter and far more precise. Control is the ability to decide when an action happens, how it is framed, and what it is connected to. And when you apply that definition here, the picture changes completely. Because if this were truly the result of maximum pressure, the opening would have been immediate, unconditional, and detached from any parallel developments. It would have been a response. What you are seeing instead is a sequence. The reopening did not happen in isolation. It arrived linked to broader signals tied to diplomatic movement and presented not as compliance, but as a gesture. That framing matters. Because a concession is something you are forced to give. A gesture is something you choose to offer. And those two things may look identical on the surface, but structurally, they are opposites. This is why the language around this moment feels so controlled. There is no sense of surrender embedded in it. There is no acknowledgement of defeat. There is instead a quiet assertion of agency. And agency is the one thing pressure is designed to remove. The entire logic of sanctions, blockades, and military escalation is to compress a country's options until only one path remains. But here, the outcome did not emerge from the absence of options. It emerged from the presence of them. And once you recognize that, the narrative begins to invert. Because the question is no longer who achieved their objective, but who retained the ability to choose. And in strategic terms, that is the only question that matters. A country that acts because it must is operating under constraint. A country that acts because it decides to is operating with control. And those are not degrees of the same thing. They are fundamentally different positions. So when you hear this described as a victory, understand what is actually being measured. The action happened, yes. But the timing, the conditions, and the framing of that action were not externally imposed. They were internally determined. And that is why this moment is not a demonstration of pressure succeeding. It is a demonstration of pressure reaching its limit. Now, to understand why that choice carried so much weight, you have to shift your attention from the decision itself to the geography that made the decision matter. Because not all actions in international politics are equal. Some actions are symbolic. Others are structural. And when a country sits on a choke point, its actions stop being local and start becoming global. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a narrow stretch of water. It is one of the most critical arteries in the global energy system, a passage through which a significant portion of the world's oil supply must travel. That means every tanker that moves through it is not just carrying energy, it is carrying stability, pricing, expectations, and the rhythm of entire economies. When that flow is uninterrupted, the world functions normally. When that flow is disrupted, the effects cascade far beyond the region. This is why control over a choke point is fundamentally different from control over territory. Territory gives you space. A choke point gives you leverage, because you are not just influencing what happens within your borders. You are influencing what happens everywhere that depends on that passage. Leverage, in strategic terms, is the ability to affect outcomes without needing to escalate constantly. So when the strait was restricted, it was not simply a local maneuver, or it was a signal to global markets, to governments, to industries that depend on predictable energy flows. And when it was reopened, it was not simply a return to normal. It was a demonstration that normal itself is conditional, that it can be interrupted and restored, not randomly, but deliberately, where the misunderstanding often occurs. People assume that closing a choke point is an act of escalation, while opening it is an act of de-escalation. But that interpretation misses the underlying mechanism. Both actions, closing and opening, are expressions of the same capability. The real power lies not in the closure or the reopening, but in the ability to move between the two states at will. Because once a country proves it can interrupt a global flow and then restore it, it establishes something far more important than temporary disruption. It establishes credibility. Not the kind of credibility that comes from statements or warnings, but the kind that comes from demonstrated capability. And in international systems, demonstrated capability reshapes behavior. It changes how other actors calculate risk, how they negotiate, how they respond to future signals. This is why the reopening carries as much weight as the restriction that preceded it. It shows that the choke point is not just physically controlled, but strategically managed. That it can be used not only to create pressure, but to release it in a way that serves a broader objective. And that transforms the choke point from a passive geographic feature into an active instrument of policy. And once that transformation is understood, the implications extend far beyond this single moment. Because any actor engaging with this situation now has to factor in not just the existence of the choke point, but the demonstrated willingness and ability to use it dynamically. That changes the negotiating environment. It shifts the balance from static power to conditional influence. So the real takeaway is not that the passage was closed or opened. The real takeaway is that both states are now part of a controlled sequence. And when a country can move a global system between disruption and stability on its own timeline, it is no longer reacting to pressure. It is shaping the conditions under which pressure operates. And this is where the analysis begins to move beyond what is visible, because the most important layer of this situation is not happening in public statements or televised briefings. It exists in the background, in the systems that were built long before this moment, and in the choices of a country that has been careful to remain present without appearing dominant. When people look for influence, they often look for movement, troops, ships, declarations. But influence, at a structural level, does not always move. Sometimes it simply holds everything else in place. This is why the role of China is so frequently misunderstood. Because it does not express power in the same language that others do. There are no dramatic entries into conflict, no visible lines crossed that trigger immediate confrontation. Instead, what you see is restraint on the surface and preparation underneath. And that combination creates a form of presence that is easy to overlook, but extremely difficult to counter. Consider what it means to shape an outcome without appearing to participate in it. That requires building systems that continue to function regardless of pressure, systems that do not depend on the approval of the dominant structure, and systems that can operate quietly enough to avoid becoming direct targets. This is not the logic of confrontation. It is the logic of insulation. And insulation, when done correctly, changes the entire environment in which decisions are made. Because once a country knows that its critical flows, its trade, its payments, or energy exchanges can continue even under external pressure, its decision-making calculus shifts. It is no longer forced into immediate responses. It gains time. And time, in strategic terms, one of the most valuable resources a country can have. It allows for patience, for sequencing, for the kind of controlled actions you are seeing now. What makes this even more significant is that these systems do not announce themselves. They are not framed as alliances or commitments. They do not trigger the same reactions that formal agreements would. They simply exist, operating in parallel, quietly reducing the effectiveness of pressure that was designed for a different kind of system. And because they are not always visible, they are often underestimated until a moment like this reveals their effect. This is the difference between direct intervention and structural influence. Direct intervention changes an outcome immediately, but often temporarily. Structural influence changes the conditions under which all future outcomes will occur. And when you look at this situation through that lens, the absence of visible action is no longer an absence of involvement. It is a different form of involvement, one that is less dramatic, far more enduring. And that endurance is what matters. Because once these structures are in place, they do not need to be rebuilt for each crisis. They continue to function quietly, supporting resilience, quietly extending options, quietly shaping what is possible and what is not. And the more they are used, the more they become part of the system itself, harder to remove, harder to bypass. So when you try to understand how a country under pressure retains the ability to act on its own terms, you have to look beyond the immediate actors and examine the environment that made that independence sustainable. Because the most decisive influence is often the wall that never needs to declare itself. And in this case, what appears as distance is not absence, it is design. What this begins to reveal, if you follow the pattern carefully, is that the traditional hierarchy of power is no longer functioning in the way most people assume. For a long time, the dominant belief was simple. Military superiority creates political outcomes. If a country could project enough force through sanctions, through blockades, through direct military pressure, it could compress the decision space of its opponent until compliance became inevitable. That model shaped decades of strategy. But what you are seeing now is not the disappearance of that model, it is its limitation, because force by itself does not operate in a vacuum. It operates within a system. And if that system begins to change, the effectiveness of force changes with it. This is where economic architecture becomes decisive. Not as a replacement for military capability, but as the environment that determines how far that capability can actually reach. Sanctions, for example, are not inherently powerful. Their power comes from the assumption that the global financial system is unified, that access to trade, currency, and payment networks can be controlled from a central point. A blockade operates on a similar assumption that restricting physical movement will create scarcity that forces negotiation. Tools are effective when the system they rely on is singular and unavoidable. But the moment alternative pathways begin to exist, their impact starts to diffuse. And that diffusion is exactly what we are seeing. When a country can reroute its trade, settle transactions outside the dominant currency channels, and maintain energy flows through indirect mechanisms, the pressure does not disappear, but it no longer concentrates in the way it was designed to. It spreads, it weakens, it becomes something that can be managed rather than something that dictates outcomes. This does not mean that military power or economic pressure are irrelevant. They still create damage. They still impose costs. But cost is not the same as control. A country can absorb significant cost and still retain decision-making autonomy if the underlying systems supporting it remain intact. And that is the critical shift from a world where pressure leads directly to compliance to a world where pressure leads to adaptation. Markets, in moments like this, give you a glimpse of that shift. They react quickly to visible changes. Prices move, sentiment adjusts, but beneath that surface, there is a growing recognition that stability is no longer guaranteed by force alone. It depends on networks, on redundancies, on the ability to continue functioning even when disrupted. And those qualities are not built in the middle of a crisis. They are built long before it begins. What you are witnessing is not simply a geopolitical event. It is an exposure of a deeper transition. Power is no longer defined solely by how much pressure you can apply, but by how much pressure the system you are operating within can absorb without breaking. And the countries that have invested in that resilience, quietly, patiently, are the ones that find themselves with options when others expect them to have none. And once resilience becomes the foundation of strategy, force alone is no longer enough to decide the outcome. And when you bring all of these threads together, what begins to emerge is something much larger than a single event or a single decision. Because this is not ultimately about a waterway being opened or a negotiation entering a new phase. It is about a shift in how power itself is structured and understood. Moments like this are often interpreted through the lens of immediate outcomes. Who gained? Who conceded? What changed in the short term? But the more important question is what this moment reveals about the system that produced it, because systems do not change suddenly. They evolve quietly, often beneath the surface, until a moment arrives that makes the change visible. And when that moment comes, it tends to be misread precisely because people are still using the old framework to interpret a new reality. That is what is happening here. The expectation was that sustained pressure would produce a predictable result. That escalation would narrow choices, force compliance, and bring about a resolution defined by the side applying that pressure. But what actually unfolded does not fit that expectation. Instead, what you are seeing is a country that absorbed that pressure, maintained enough internal continuity to avoid collapse, and then acted at a moment of its own choosing. And that ability to endure without immediate capitulation, to wait, and then to act selectively is what signals a deeper structural change. Because it suggests that the mechanisms designed to force outcomes are no longer universally decisive. They still matter, but they no longer guarantee the result they once did. And this is why the implications extend far beyond this specific situation. Every government observing this is not just evaluating the immediate actors involved, it is evaluating the model itself. We're asking whether the tools that have defined global influence for decades, financial pressure, controlled access to markets, the ability to isolate an economy, still function with the same reliability. And if the answer is even partially uncertain, then strategic calculations begin to shift. Because once there is doubt about whether pressure will lead to submission, alternative strategies become more attractive. Countries begin to invest in resilience rather than alignment, in diversification rather than dependence. Fourta, they look for ways to ensure that their own systems can continue to operate under stress, rather than assuming that avoiding stress is always possible. And as more actors make that shift, the system itself begins to transform. This is how structural change spreads, not through a single declaration, but through a series of observed outcomes that alter behavior over time. One country demonstrates that it can withstand pressure and still retain agency. Others take note, they adjust, and gradually the balance moves away from those who rely primarily on applying pressure toward those who can endure it. So what you are witnessing is not just a demonstration of resilience in one case. It is a signal to the entire system that resilience is becoming the more valuable form of power. And once that signal is absorbed, it does not disappear. It shapes future decisions, future investments, future strategies in ways that are difficult to reverse. And that is why this moment matters. Not because of what it resolves today, but because of what it changes for tomorrow. So when you step back and look at this entire sequence, the conclusion becomes difficult to ignore. What appeared to be a simple reopening was, in reality, a demonstration of who still holds the ability to choose. Pressure was applied at scale, but it did not dictate the outcome. Instead, resilience absorbed it, delayed it, and ultimately reshaped it. And once that happens, the meaning of power begins to change. Not from force to weakness, but from force to limitation. Because in a system where outcomes depend on endurance as much as pressure, the side that decides the moment decides the result.